And he said that he had always put up barriers between himself and his people he met in business, to protect himself, but that this process was letting the barriers come down. He was expressing himself in real time and, just honestly, such as you don't do with a lot of people.
Right. All these people that came after that had a lasting, massive impact on the history of this country.
That's right.
I mean, that's a big deal.
One reason that he's called the forgotten founding father is that he never ran. He ran for office in Virginia. He was attorney general and he was the clerk of the House of Burgesses. So there's some poems in the back about this courtship reflections. And so early on, he told me that he was a hopeless romantic. I'd never met a hopeless romantic before. And then I found out what he meant. We really can't feel useful. We should all be useful people. We can't feel useful until we're really helping other people. And that could be, teaching classes. It could be anything. It could be calling up a lonely person, just, getting out of ourselves. So I write about that too.
That's great.
You want to see the cover of the book?
Can I ask you a question? Did you know that there's a technology that uses sound waves that'll tell your brain what to do? There literally is. It's called newcalm.com. It can tell your brain to heal, tell your brain to sleep, tell your brain to do all kinds of things. It can get you fired up. It can be a pre-workout. Newcalm.com. And the promo code is Mike15. Newcalm.com, promo code Mike15 for an extra 15% off. Go today.
Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience podcast. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. Mike is passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
Suzanne Munson, thank you so much for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. Like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. So with your permission, we'll start with where you were born, go all the way up to today, and then we want to talk about these 4 amazing books that you've written. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
So where were you born?
I was born in a small town in Southwest Virginia, next to where Virginia Tech is located.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Love Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
What's the name of the town?
My town was Christiansburg, which was next to Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech is. And so I look back on that time as a kinder, gentler period of time for people to grow up. And we spent a lot of time outdoors. We made our own entertainment. And most of us were free-range kids. I was definitely a free-range kid. And my parents seldom worried about me. I'd be gone for hours. And I was fortunate. I had ponies and horses, and I could get out in the country and commune with Mother Nature. And I spent a lot of time by myself. And so this was before drugs were in high schools and college. And I'm really telling my age right now. But it definitely was a kinder, gentler period. Obviously, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't even have email back then. So if we wanted to entertain ourselves, we made up our own entertainment, or we actually talked to our friends on the phone or in person.
What a novel concept.
You can imagine that.
Yeah.
Our phone was on the wall, and of course, my mother could hear everything I said. But I, in my little town, my friends were goody two-shoes girls. They were real sweet, but they would never get in trouble. They didn't smoke, they didn't drink, they didn't cuss, and they didn't speak unkindly about people. And one time I spoke unkindly about somebody, and I was told that I should look for their good qualities. So,
you don't have anything positive to say
Yeah.
Don't say anything, right?
Well, yeah, right. So I said, "Well, that little brat." And then my friend said, "Well, he has pretty blue eyes." So that was my lesson in watching what I said about people.
What was your favorite thing about growing up there?
Well, I like the outdoors, and I sort of lived in what you could call the suburbs, a nice old shady street, nice old houses on it. But I had a lot of access to the country. Yeah. And so I did a lot of communing with Mother Nature. And I think that helped form my character today. I still need to do that.
So growing up, who was the most influential person to you?
Definitely my mother. Yeah. She lost a child, my baby sister, to a very horrific accident. And it changed her forever. And but she didn't resort to drinking or mind-numbing drugs or a lot of self-recrimination. She decided she would become a useful person. She became a very spiritual person and kind of out of the box, not just traditional things. And just very adventuresome. She read a lot and she taught me a lot. She was always telling me what she was reading. And she would read out of the box books, by Edgar Cayce and people like that other people weren't reading. And I was exposed to those ideas. And she's very strong. She sort of became, when she decided to make herself useful to other people after my sister died, she became kind of an unpaid social worker. And she was always helping people in jails or giving food to people or just helping people out. And she was a really, really good role model for me. She was very independent, very different from my father. My father was Mr. Businessman, good man. He was a good father, but not interested in any of the things that she was. Yeah. And so when I went away to college and my father asked me what I was majoring in, I said, English. And he said, well, why don't you major in something practical like home economics? But I'll have to say that I was going back to my childhood. My sixth grade teacher encouraged me in my writing, and she said she thought I was a good writer. And just that one sentence stuck with me. And I decided that's what I wanted to do. And my mother encouraged me in my writing too. And so then I majored in English, and that gave me a craft. I didn't take creative writing. Probably should take that sometime. But I took an expository writing class.
You should be teaching creative writing.
Huh?
You should be teaching creative writing.
Well, I mean, I write a lot of history, and I try to make it interesting. I try to make it a little creative, but you can't make up stuff when you're writing history,
Agreed.
You have to, the most you can do is just imagine so-and-so might have thought at this time or might have met somebody. But you have to be very careful and footnote everything. But then again, that's just my history books. I've written a book of poetry, although I don't call it a book of poetry. It's a book of reflections because nobody reads poems anymore. And then I've done some out of the box things, some metaphysical things. But anyway, the English major really gave me a craft that I've used all my life. For all of my jobs, I've written in part or in whole of what I did. Did a lot of annual reports and speeches and brochures and website content, that sort of thing.
Where did you go to college?
Well, I followed my significant other, and he was getting a PhD at the University of Maryland. And otherwise, I never would have gone there. But anyway, I finished college in 3 years at the University of Maryland. I really worked too hard to finish early, but he sort of wanted me to finish early and get out and make a living. Anyway, so I just worked all the time in college. I took, 18 hours at a time. And when you're an English major, you read all these books and all these plays, and, it's a lot harder than majoring in a lot of other things.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. A lot of work.
Yeah.
What did your husband do?
My current husband, well, one of my books was written after my late husband died in 2013. He was an attorney.
Oh.
And so my book of reflections is about processing the grief after that loss and learning to live mindfully. And we'll get into that in a little bit. My current husband, who I met online, and we can talk about that too if you want to, is an international businessman, and he does not. His office is here in the house, if you want to call it an office. He's on the computer a lot, but we have matching desks, and he's a big help to me because he's much better with computer things than I am. And so if I want something, he put me on LinkedIn, and he did my author website and all that. It was very, very helpful. And when I give a talk, I give a lot of talks. I always have him there to make sure the PowerPoint works, all those things.
I love that. That's awesome. So you have your own in-house tech support. This is cool.
I do.
Mine's my 24-year-old daughter.
Oh, that helps too.
And her favorite thing to say is, "Oh, Dad."
Oh, yeah, rolling the eyes. I guess we did that to our parents too. And
I apparently do in 90 keystrokes what you can do in 3. That's about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm apparently really good at doing way too much to get to a shortcut, or do something that can be done with a shortcut. So after college, where do you go to work?
Well, in those days, and again, I'm dating myself. This is before Women's Lib.
Yeah.
There are basically 4 things that a woman did. Be a mother and a housewife, number 1. Secretary, teacher. What's the other one? Nurse. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I trained to be a teacher, and I took education classes, and I taught senior high school English for 1 year, and it nearly killed me.
I was just going to ask, what was that like?
That was, well,
kind of grueling.
The good thing about it is that the students were much better behaved then.
Oh.
You didn't feel threatened, when you went to work, as the teachers do today for various reasons, from parents as well as students these days.
Kidding.
It's awful.
I agree with that.
But I had 150 students, and 5 classes, and I wanted, being, somebody who cared about my students, I wanted to teach them to write. So what did that mean? 150 essays, 150 term papers. Try grading 150 term papers in your spare time.
Yeah, no kidding.
Anyway, I just exhausted me, and I understand why young people are not taught writing, because the teachers have got to have a private life, and anyway, that the whole thing needs to be reformed. Teachers need a lighter workload, and they do need to teach kids to write, but they don't have time right now. And so then after that, I moved to South Carolina. I was making decent money in Maryland, and but in South Carolina, the teacher salaries were not good. So I sort of stumbled into a job in public relations, and that informed the rest of my career. And I went to work at the University of South Carolina PR department, public information department. And I had an old journalist as my boss, and he taught me how to write a news release. Even though I was an English major, I'd never been taught how to write a news release. And he was later on, we might get into my concerns about the lack of objectivity today in journalism. But he was so schooled in journalism that if I would say, right, Professor so-and-so is an expert in this subject, he would cross out expert. He would say, no, he's a specialist. That fine a point. Because he was a trained journalist, and unfortunately, not many are trained these days in objectivity.
Well, and accuracy.
And accuracy, right.
Right? Language has power.
Yes.
Let's be honest. It does.
Yes.
And what you write has even more power.
That's right.
And so, when you put it out there in the ether, right? It's, and that's part of what I believe legacy media is having a tough time with right now, because they're really in, I guess the best way to put it is a legitimacy crisis. They're in a place where they're not regarded or trusted the way that they used to be,
right?
Because they, clickbait, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure you've read some of these articles, and I'm sure that it absolutely curls your hair when you read some of them. They didn't proofread it. Lord knows they didn't put any more thought into it. If they didn't proofread it before they released it, what sort of preparation went into it, right? The difference between specialist and expert, it's like, right. Those are things that are now overlooked, I believe.
Yes.
And what's your opinion?
Well, in my day, if you majored in journalism, that was a high calling, to work for a newspaper. And here in Richmond, Virginia, where I live, our newspaper was very prosperous, mm-hmm. and they could afford to pay their reporters well. Mm-hmm. And in those days, we had a huge newsroom and a huge newspaper. And what really concerns me is the demise of the daily paper. Yeah. We have our other media, but it's click media.
Yeah.
And the sacred duty of a local newspaper is to do investigative reporting. Mm-hmm. And our paper has gotten so thin, they still have investigative reporters. They don't cover a lot of things they used to. But without those guys, there are 2 or 3 guys who they have ferreted out corruption, mm-hmm. Incompetence, so many of the things that have been wrong with our city government. Mm-hmm. And they've been out there for everybody to see. Mm-hmm. Without the newspaper, that would not have happened. You might have had a snippet or 2 on TV, but nothing in depth.
It's the fourth estate.
Yes.
Right. And mm-hmm. it needs, anyway, I'm on my soapbox. I'm going to get off. But what do you think about how legacy media can correct this?
Well, everybody's online now. I get my news online now. Mm. I'm really not quite sure how to correct it. I think that we are much less well-informed now than we were 20 years ago.
I agree with that.
And I think people just need to wake up that they're not well-informed. And maybe it's going to take a complete crisis, a complete breakdown in our government for people to get off the golf course and into public discourse. Mm-hmm. It's going to take something major to wake people up, I think. Yeah. And I think this next year, we're going to see some big things happening. You hope that the schools will teach children everything they need to know. But I think there is a movement to get government back into education. Mm-hmm. And maybe, hey, read your local newspaper, even if you get it online, and write a report on a certain story. Get people more engaged in news, but not biased news. Right. News that is objective as can be. Yeah. But I think our young people have to be taught to get back to being alert citizens and not just let everything kind of cruise by, and you spend all of your time on TikTok and whatever media that they're using. It's very self-indulgent.
It's amazing where people get their news.
We need to be taught to be better citizens, and democracy is not a spectator sport. It has become a spectator sport.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people who voted in this last election without knowing anything. They voted because eggs were more expensive than last year. I know somebody like that.
I know somebody like that too.
Yeah.
Okay. So at some point you decide to write your first book. And I believe it's Of Loss and Love, right? Journey of the Heart.
No,
is that your first book?
Third book.
Oh, your third. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have the order messed up. I apologize. What was your first book?
Well, that was an interesting journey. I've always been interested in history. My parents were interested in history and our ancestry and the people who came over here for religious liberty, not just for economic gain. And so while I was still working, I could not write. I didn't have time to write a book. I had a family to raise. I had a mother. I had two in diapers at the same time. I had my mother in a nursing home and my little girl in diapers, plus a very demanding job and lots of other things. So while I was still working, somebody knew that I liked to read history. And so they suggested that I read this book about, it's called I Am Murdered. And it's about a founding father, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, George Wythe from Virginia, who is the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who has the distinction of being murdered. I think he was collateral material, really, but it's a long story.
Was he scalped?
No, some of my ancestors were scalped, but that was before, when settlement was new here.
Right.
No, he was born in 1726 and died in 1806. He was Thomas Jefferson's teacher.
Yeah.
Anyway, I read this book about his murder and the trial of his nephew, which was a miscarriage of justice. But in reading the book, I said, wow, this man was great. I've really never heard of him. I've seen his name down in Williamsburg. There's a George Wythe house, which is quite beautiful in Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg. And I said, I didn't know anything about this man, but he was very, very important to the early success of this country, this democratic republic. So I said, well, somebody needs to write a modern biography of him. And so I had lunch with a friend of mine who writes history, and I said, you really ought to get on this. But he was on to something else. And so when I retired, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, hey, I can write this book now. I can do it. And it was just the greatest feeling of elation. So I spent, then my husband got sick and I had to take care of him, and then he died. And so it took me a long time to write that book because, excuse me, for some reason I couldn't get anything done at home, like really focus intently.
Yeah.
I'd see a dust ball or plant that needed watering or something and get distracted. So I went to a lot of retreats and spiritual retreats and writing retreats. And finally, I published the book in 2017, I think. So that book is the one with the footnotes and the bibliography. And I tried to make it interesting for people. It's not like a PhD thesis. It's not dry. And it has pretty good rating on Amazon.
Yeah, I saw that. Go ahead.
And I give a lot of lectures on the Wythe Jefferson legacy.
So are there people in the audience that hadn't heard of him either?
In your audience or in my audiences?
In your audience.
Well, in Virginia, he's somewhat known in this part of Virginia.
Oh, gotcha.
Because of his house in Colonial Williamsburg is on the list of places to be visited.
Yeah.
And there is an enactor, George Wythe enactor in Colonial Williamsburg. So he's somewhat known. But outside of this area, he's been forgotten. There are some streets that were named after him and neighborhoods and schools. even a college, I think. But largely he's been forgotten, and he's called the forgotten founding father.
Yeah.
And he had so much to do with training our first leaders.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
Mm-hmm.
Especially Thomas Jefferson.
And he was highly ethical. He was among all the early leaders. I can't say he was the most ethical, because you can't say that about anybody, but he was one of the most highly regarded leaders for his very high sense of ethics and statesmanship.
How did he die?
Oh, okay. Well, when he was legally able to free his slaves, he did so. And one of them was his housekeeper. And she followed him from Williamsburg to Richmond to keep house, and he paid wages to her. Mm. And then there were 2 mulatto boys that he was teaching. I kind of think they might have been his. Yeah. But anyway, he he didn't abandon them. He was teaching them, and he left, in his will, he left part of his estate to the housekeeper and to these 2 young men. Mm-hmm. And so he had a nephew, a great nephew, who had gotten into drinking and gambling. His father was an alcoholic. And so his mother sent him to live with George Wythe in Richmond, hoping that some of Wythe's good qualities would rub off on the boy. And so the boy was too far gone by then. He was a teenager. And and Richmond had a lot of vices back then. Mm-hmm. Still does, but I think they weren't quite as open now as they were then. They had gambling places and houses of prostitution that were open and so on. Anyway, he on bars, and so he got in trouble, and he started stealing from his great uncle. And Wythe didn't mind the money so much as he began stealing his prized scientific implements and his books. He prized his books. He had one of the biggest libraries in America.
Wow. So
he told the boy that if he didn't change his ways, that he was going to get less of the inheritance, maybe none at all. So the boy, while Wythe was away, rifled through his desk and found the will. And he saw where these people of color were going to receive part of the estate. But if he outlived them, he would get their share. So murder was on his mind one day. So he came in Wythe's house when breakfast was being served. And the housekeeper saw him pour something into the coffee, a yellow substance. And she thought it was strange, but she didn't know what to think. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the coffee damaged her. She drank a little bit of it, but she lived. It killed the young boy who was in the house, who was supposed to be a really fine young man. And then it made its way upstairs with George Wythe's breakfast. Now, whether that was intended or not, we're not really sure whether he really wanted to murder his uncle at that time. But he did want the money right away. So it took Wythe 2 weeks to die. It was a very painful death. It's rat poison, arsenic. Oh, gosh. And he did have time to write the boy out of his will. And he did utter the expression, "I am murdered." He knew that he had been murdered. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, it was a miscarriage of justice when the boy was brought to trial. He was convicted, I think, of embezzling. He had forged some checks, but not on the murders, because all of the eyewitnesses were people of color, and no one with a drop of African blood could testify against a white man in court. And so he went away, and then legend has it that he became a horse thief in Tennessee that he was never heard of again.
Wow.
But in reading all about that, I found out what an absolutely marvelous human being this man was.
Yeah.
Humanitarian. He literally saved the Constitution from during its ratification rounds. Not only signed the Declaration of Independence, but he mentored Jefferson. He was Jefferson's great mentor in the ideals that are in the Declaration. The wonderful, noble ideals in the beginning were not. They're not unique to Jefferson. They came from John Locke and some of the Enlightenment philosophers that Jefferson was exposed to in his time in college and as George Wythe's legal apprentice. Wow. Not original to Jefferson.
What a man. What a man. So at some point you decide to write your second book. What do you write your second book about?
We might skip that one till later. That's the metaphysical book.
Is it?
I don't want people to think I'm crazy.
It's okay.
That's a channeled book.
So let's skip to the third one. What's your third book about?
That is called Of Loss and Love. And that was a book that I started writing after my husband died. And even though I was an English major, I never had a desire to write poetry. And but when he died, I started getting these insights about things that I thought were important to write down. And so I don't call them poems, I call them reflections, because this book is really a journal of the 3 years after his death and my journey during that time. Yeah. And so the first reflections were, and I explain each reflection as it comes up, what I was doing, thinking. The first ones were about grief, processing my grief, how I was processing my grief. And then I got into living mindfully, and I wrote a reflection, at least one reflection, about each of the 5 senses, because I think that we go through life kind of numb, really. You know, we're just thinking stupid thoughts about inconsequential things, or we may have big problems that are concerning us, and we don't stop and smell the roses, to coin a phrase. And so I tried to become more mindful, move out of the grief and become more mindful of our gifts that we're given, these simple little gifts. And so I wrote about each of those senses and totally different ones, like sight. I had a beautiful sunset, taste, not gobbling down this fabulous tomato sandwich that I made for myself, but kind of eating it more mindfully. That's kind of cute. And touch, when you've lost a spouse, you lose the sense of touch to some extent. And so then I wrote about other things that I was learning. I wrote about my spiritual journey. I went on quite a spiritual journey. I wanted to know, well, after my husband died, I would go outdoors at night and I would look at the stars and I would say, where are you? I'm not hearing anything. I'm not getting anything. Just crickets in the night, And so I wanted to know where he went, where we all go. I wanted to know what we do when we get there. And I wanted to know the point of it all. Like, do we have a plan for ourselves when we come in? And do we eventually find out what that plan is? Things like that. And then I was not lonely in the usual sense of the word because I went out a lot. I'd made a point to make new friends because most of my friends were couples, and they do their thing. Single people do their thing. Yeah. So I made a list of all the single women of any interest that I knew. And I called them up and said, let's have lunch or let's go to the theater. And so I made new friends. And then I was writing my book and going to different places with the book. And I had my family. So I wasn't lonely in that sense, but my heart was lonely. I had felt whole. And then I was feeling half. I was feeling like I was half of a person. And I wanted to be whole again. Yeah. So I confided to 2 friends that I'd like to have another partner. And both of them said, well, there's a site on Match.com for people your age. So I said, well, okay. So I wrote it down. I keep a notebook with me at all times because I live by my notes. I could not survive without my lists, and that's a great stress reliever. Anyway, so I took my pocketbook list of notes and transferred it to my computer list of notes. So eventually I wrote a picked my very best picture out and wrote a profile of myself. It was very detailed. A lot of these profiles that you see online are like, oh, I like walks on the beach. I like, watching Dancing with the Stars and, stuff like that. But I was very specific about who I was and who I wasn't, what I was looking for, what I was not looking for. And so I was online 11 days and I learned a lot, and I saw some phonies and, and some people that I definitely would not like to connect with. And, I had some people who were pinging me or flirting with me or whatever they call it online, but nobody of interest. So meanwhile, on the other side of the country in Houston, Texas, there was a man who had just lost his wife to cancer, and he was just coming out of that. And he was not the type to go online. His friends were trying to fix him up with women, and that was not successful. So an ad for a free trial came up and of this website. So he said, well, what the heck? It's free. So he put his profile up and his picture. Well, within hours, all the women of Houston were all over him. And so he took a few out to lunch, and those didn't work out.
Yeah.
And so 2 days after he'd been online, my profile popped up and my picture. And so he was flipping through a lot of the pictures that were being sent to him. And then he stopped at mine, read my profile. And then he wrote me the very nicest letter of introduction. This is on a Friday afternoon. And, that he saw my profile and saw that we had certain similarities. And maybe we'd like to have a conversation. So I said, fine, why don't we switch to email so we can really talk privately? I said, I'm babysitting right now, but I'll get back to you later tonight. In the meantime, tell me about yourself, your politics, the books you're reading, and your career path. So I said, let's cut to the chase. Let's don't waste any time. And now a lot of men would have backed off at that. They wouldn't have wanted to do that because there are a lot of people who were just interested in one night stands or they're not very serious people.
Yeah.
But he was very serious about finding a new partner, as serious as I was. And so he took it as a challenge. He wrote me this long epistle about the books he was reading and his career path and his politics. And I thought, well, they were mostly business books like Friedman, but I approved of those because they were more of an international nature, geopolitics. And I had read a few of them. So that was good. And the politics were good, socially moderate, fiscally conservative, independent. Although we've both voted Democratic and Republican at various times. We're independent thinkers. We'll try to be. Anyway, don't want to talk about politics. But and then he told me his career path, which was very interesting. So then because we couldn't meet because there was more than 1,000 miles between us, we had to get to know each other in writing, which is the very best thing that could ever have happened. We were forced to express ourselves. And we must have sent, I don't know, in the course of our courtship, I guess you'd call it, 500 emails back and forth.
Wow.
Sometimes several a day.
Did you know there's an app that has no side effects that allows you to use sound waves to tell your brain what you want it to do? It's called newcalm.com, and it's amazing. It literally uses sound waves. If you want to tell your brain to go to sleep, if you want to tell your brain to recover, if you want to tell your brain to put you in peak physical state, if you want to tell your brain to focus, if you want to tell your brain to take a power nap, you can do all of these things and more with newcalm.com. Go to newcalm.com today, promo code Mike15. Newcalm.com, promo code Mike15 for an extra 15% off. Go there today.
And he said that he had always put up barriers between himself and his people he met in business, to protect himself, but that this process was letting the barriers come down. He was expressing himself in real time and, just honestly, such as you don't do with a lot of people. And so he called it our courtship of letters.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he had been standing on the internet highway waiting for a ride my way, which I thought was rather poetic.
That's very poetic. I like that. That's cool.
So things were going so well for us in writing. We were afraid to talk on the phone. I thought, oh, he'll probably have some horrible Texas accent. Excuse me.
Does he?
No, very, very Midwestern, but very nice. Very nice. And so then we started talking on the phone, and I was a little bit nervous about that. And then we started talking every night. Anyway, it's a long story, but it became very romantic. Toward the end of my book, back to my book of loss and love, I lost and I began to love again. So there's some poems in the back about this courtship reflections. And so early on, he told me that he was a hopeless romantic. I'd never met a hopeless romantic before. And then I found out what he meant. He said, finally, we agreed to meet. And I said, I want to meet in Washington. I don't want you to come to Richmond because somebody might see us. It's awkward. Yeah. And my daughter was in Washington. I thought if it didn't work out, I could just go see her. Mm-hmm. And so I said, okay, you're flying in at a certain time. If your plane is late, I'll meet you in the restaurant and the train station. And he said, no, that won't do. I'll meet you on the platform. So first time we ever saw each other, he met me on the platform with 24 yellow roses and a porter and a big black limo.
He really is a hopeless romantic. Yeah. So how did that affect you?
Over the top.
How did that affect you?
I just went along for the ride. I thought it was kind of amusing.
Were you impressed, or were you?
Oh, those things don't impress me too much. I mean, I thought it was really sweet. Yeah. But I was really more interested in, what the man was going to be like.
To go to the effort.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's it like being married to a hopeless romantic?
He loves roses in the house. Well, he's one of these unusual people. He's got a sensitive side, but he's also a really hard businessman. Mm-hmm. That's a real good combination, I think.
Yeah.
He was very serious about, finding a life partner. He's not a player at all. Mm-hmm. Not that he could be at our age, but even as a younger man, I don't think he was ever a player. Yeah. I think he was devoted to his first wife. It's kind of nice to get a widower sometime, No, we're very happy. One thing I did sense immediately was that he was Mr. Businessman. Mm-hmm. It was like 100% of his identity. Mm-hmm. And I knew that he was capable of more than that. And so I said, you need to stop and smell roses, buddy. Mm-hmm. And said, well, maybe you can do that with me. Mm-hmm. And so also he had jobs all over the world, and he had never put roots down any place. Mm-hmm. He'd never had time to be involved in his community, make it a better place. Mm-hmm. So I never said that I wouldn't move to Houston, but I have really, really deep roots here in Virginia. My whole life is here. My friends are here. My career is here. Everything is here. And it would have been very foolish for me to go across the country just for one person, no matter how much you care about that person. At my age, it would have been high risk. He, on the other hand, was used to moving, and it was really not a big decision for him to move here. And so I had friends who were influential in the community, and I asked one of them to fund some boards, community nonprofits that Jim might be able to help with his expertise. So he's on at least 2 nonprofit boards. And he has put roots down in this community, and we're making new friends. Mm-hmm. We travel, we have a good life.
That's good. So how does he like being on the boards?
Well, he had to be on the right committees because he hasn't been here long enough to be on the fundraising committee and know all the big old money here. You need to know those people. Yeah. He didn't know them. But he's on things like long-range planning and finance and stuff like that.
Is he enjoying it?
Oh, very much, very much. And we do a lot of work with recovering alcoholics and drug addicts. That's probably our most favorite thing to do. Yeah. The work that gives us the most satisfaction.
Got to be fulfilling.
Yeah. So there's a place in Richmond called the Healing Place, which is, in my mind, the best of its kind anywhere in the world. And it's a 12-month rehabilitation program for recovering drug addicts and alcoholics. But based on the 12 steps, it's very AA oriented. Mm-hmm. And so toward the end of their 12 months, they are given work skills. Mm-hmm. Some of them have never used a computer or email or anything like that. Some of them have come from under the bridge, mm-hmm. And so we get to work with them when they're getting ready to come out in the world. And we teach classes and we coach them on their interview skills. And we've gotten to know a lot of them, and we're all equal. We all have had our problems, mm-hmm. and I relate to them quite a lot, and they relate to me. And I try to be funny and salty when I can. They like that. Yeah. Use a few.
I'll bet you're amazing with them.
We get along really well. Yeah, but other people wouldn't be comfortable doing that. Yeah. Everybody needs to do volunteer work. Everybody needs to give of themselves, but maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable with people off the streets who are alcoholics. Maybe your calling would be holding the hand of an elderly person in a nursing home, anything to be of service to others, or playing the piano in a nursing home or food kitchen, anything. Yeah. But we cannot feel gratitude. The basic qualities of or requisites for being happy are, number one, gratitude. And I wrote a poem about that in my book of Loss and Love. Mm-hmm. The importance of gratitude, and being of service, and giving yourself. We really can't feel useful. We should all be useful people. We can't feel useful until we're really helping other people, and that could be teaching classes. It could be anything. It could be calling up a lonely person. Just getting out of ourselves. So I write about that too.
That's great.
You want to see the cover of the book?
Absolutely.
Okay. There it is.
There you go.
Yeah. And whoops. And then this, my husband did this cover. That's supposed to be me walking. And anyway, it was much thinner. And I said, well, you need to make it look more like me now. So he added a little weight. Oh. Anyway, that's on Amazon of Loss and Love. And my name is Suzanne Munson. If you forget the book, Munson. I have 4 books up there.
So let's talk about your 4th book.
Yes, the one that just came out. That's called, well, I'll show you. This is the cover. Mm-hmm. You can see that.
First in Law, First in Leadership, William and Mary.
Right. This is about what my friend George Wythe did from 1779 to 1789. He was America's first law professor.
Ooh, I didn't realize that. That's cool.
First and only law professor for a number of years. And he taught, Jefferson was one of his legal apprentices. Yeah. He also taught Chief Justice John Marshall, Henry Clay, and 200 future leaders of this country.
Yeah.
And so not only did he teach his students law, and that's all a lot of the boys wanted. They just wanted a law degree and get back home and make money because they'd gone to the only law school, collegiate law school in the country.
Right.
Everybody else who was a lawyer had been an apprentice to an older lawyer. And it was very, very uneven, just depending on how much the older lawyer wanted to teach. Yeah. Now, in George Wythe's case, he was an apprentice to his uncle, and he learned nothing because his uncle made him do all the scut work.
Yeah.
So he decided, all the writing, all the documents.
Researching and all that. Yeah.
Research, yeah. And so when he became a teacher of law, he was determined that he would give his best to his students. And he had studied, mostly English law was used in Virginia because we were an English colony. But when we broke with England, we started writing our own laws. And so he taught not only English law, but the laws that were being written here in America. And he had something to do with the Constitution as well. But not just that kind of law. He went back to medieval law, Greek and Roman law. He was a Greek and Roman scholar. He had studied all the philosophers. So he taught the boys law, and that's all they wanted. But he had a captive audience. And he said, "You're not leaving here until you're a completely, thoroughly well-educated human being." So he exposed them to literature, history, some science, ancient cultures, just lots of things.
Made them more well-rounded.
Well-rounded individuals.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, he said, "I want you not just to go home and have a profession and make money. You are among the best educated people in America. You need to lead this country." And so he started teaching right in the middle of the American Revolution. And a lot of his students went away to fight and came back. And then his last year of teaching was right the year when the Constitution came into effect. So America, the nation was just starting, and it could easily have gone in the wrong direction. And Thomas Jefferson could easily have gone in the wrong direction. Nobody knows that unless you read some of his letters. But in letters to his grandson, he said, "Oh, I used to hang out with card sharps and racetrack bookies and all kinds of unsavory characters when I was a college student," because he was totally unsupervised.
Yeah.
And he said, "But then I started meeting these older men of distinction. And then I would ask myself, which type of individual do I want to be when I grow up?" And he chose to start hanging out with the mature adults, and they weren't just ordinary adults. They were men of distinction, men of letters. One was the English governor at the time, who was an enlightened man, Governor Fauquier. Another was Jefferson's undergraduate teacher, Dr. Small, and another was George Wythe. And he decided that he would emulate these people. So he learned all of his fine manners and graciousness at the governor's table, elegant dinner table in the palace in Williamsburg. And his undergraduate teacher exposed him to the world of ideas. But it wasn't until he became tutored by George Wythe for a number of years as his legal student that he really got the idea of being a public servant, leading the country, and the principles of a democratic republic, the ideal of religious freedom. Now, Jefferson takes total credit on his tombstone for writing America's first religious freedom law. He did write it in beautiful prose, better prose than Wythe would have written it, but it was a partnership. They co-sponsored that legislation, proposed legislation, when it went to the General Assembly in 1779. They had been on a committee to revise Virginia law. In fact, the three things that Jefferson wanted on his tombstone, and I have this in my book. I'll show you the book. Jefferson's Godfather,
Mm-hmm.
The Man Behind the Man.
Mm-hmm.
That's my first book. Anyway, there's a chapter on each of the three things that Jefferson wanted on his tombstone. The first is author of the Declaration of Independence. And I show in my book that the ideals, and he later on said that the ideals he expressed there were not original to him. It's just that he was such a beautiful writer.
Mm-hmm.
But George Wythe, and I can prove this in some letters that he wrote, actually helped organize the second section, which nobody reads. But it's the list of grievances against King George III. And being a really, really good lawyer, George Wythe wanted all those grievances not to be just general complaints, but to be documented. These things actually happen. Your troops actually did this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's 20 or 30 grievances that are there that he asked to be documented by the governors of the states. So there's nothing that I've ever read that credited him with that second part, other than the letter that went out before the Declaration of Independence was written. So I kind of connected the dots. So Jefferson, that was the first thing, author of the Declaration of Independence. I traced Wythe's mind behind that. And there's a chapter on that, a really long chapter on what Wythe did in the Continental Congress to back George Washington. Wythe was friends or mentor of the first 5 presidents. He was George Washington's personal attorney, and he had his back in Continental Congress when everybody else was lazy and not helping George Washington the way they should, not raising money. And he also had Washington's back in the French and Indian War when Wythe was in the Virginia legislature. Anyway, so second thing that Jefferson wanted on his tombstone was author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And so there were 5 prominent Virginians who were tasked with revising Virginia's legal code when we broke with England. Mm-hmm. Because we had a lot of old laws that were needed to be thrown out or revised. And so it was a committee of 5, and eventually it became a committee of 2 through attrition. And that was George Wythe and Thomas Jefferson, mm-hmm. Wythe being the mentor. And there's a whole chapter on that in my book, Jefferson's Godfather, on how that, on religious freedom. And it's real interesting too, because there was a lot of religious discrimination in Virginia, as there was in some of the other colonies. And they didn't admit Catholics at all in the early days because of the religious wars that were still fresh in England. It was all about politics. Yeah. And there were these draconian laws on the books from the 17th century about the poor Quakers. They were treated terribly, or at least the laws treated them terribly. And so Wythe's ancestors being Quakers, he knew about those laws because his ancestors were persecuted. Yeah, and so he was the one, and Jefferson grew up in an Anglican family, traditional family. There were no mavericks and religious mavericks in his family, whereas Wythe came from a family of mavericks, religious mavericks. So I traced Wythe's mind behind, that law. Plus, they were co-sponsors of that and 125 other laws that they presented to the General Assembly. Now, not all of them were acted upon because there were great reforms in some of those, like universal education. You think those old plantation grandees were going to spend any tax dollars on educating the children of their workers? I don't think so.
Not back then.
No. And that they were the ones who would pay taxes for any of their reforms. And religious freedom was another reform. And so that law was not passed in Virginia until 1786, and only passed because the the best fighters in the American Revolution were the Baptists and the Presbyterians. Mm-hmm. Probably not the people in Eastern Virginia. They sent their slaves to fight. Probably. Well, there were some of them who did fight, but the mountain people were the toughest fighters. And a lot of them were Presbyterians and Baptists. Anyway, they came back after winning their freedom from England to have their religious freedom compromised. Mm-hmm. And so they made a big stink in the General Assembly in 1786. And another person indirectly influenced by George Wythe was James Madison through his mentorship of Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson was Madison's friend and mentor. So Madison and some others, and a Baptist preacher, pushed through the religious freedom law, but over great opposition from Patrick Henry and a lot of the conservatives who felt that Virginians would slide into perdition, go to hell, without an official religion that everybody would be taxed for. Yeah. And all the outlying religions were frowned upon, and those people could not hold public office, couldn't even have a wedding without their own preacher. So, yeah. Wow. Dark ages.
So did we cover the third thing that Jefferson wanted on
No, we didn't. Yeah, thank you. The third thing that he wanted on his tombstone was father of the University of Virginia. And Harvard and some of the early colleges were founded to train preachers. Mm-hmm. They weren't not founded to give somebody a totally universal university education. Right. Education was pretty narrow. It was very strict, hard discipline. It's a very hard life to be a student in those days. So Thomas Jefferson's experience in Williamsburg as an undergraduate and under the tutelage of George Wythe really shaped his ideals for the University of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And the University of Virginia was the first school that was non-sectarian. If people wanted to practice their religion, they could do so outside of the school grounds. You know, they could set up their churches there and however they wish to meet, but there would not be an official religious program there. And instead of just learning Latin and dead languages, which were taught, modern languages were introduced. There was a school of medicine, literature was taught, modern history, ancient history. And so that reflected Jefferson's very broad mind. He had a universal mind, that you should learn everything about everything that was worth learning. And so he put this wonderful buffet of education out for his boys. And also he designed, it's on the UNESCO World whatever sites of historic places, is the Jefferson's design for the original university. Mm-hmm. And he designed the building so that the faculty could be very close to the students. The classes were downstairs in the faculty houses. Faculty lived upstairs. The students' rooms were next door. There were gardens in the back where they could meet and converse. And all this reflected his very good experience in Williamsburg with his teachers there. And even the diet was the diet that he had learned from George Wythe. It was mostly vegetarian with flavoring of meat. And so the having classes downstairs worked for everybody except for the wife of the medical professor, who didn't like having cadavers downstairs in her house. So Jefferson built the first observatory for dissecting and whatever else they wanted to do.
To get all that out of her house?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So Sam or George Wythe sounds like somebody that firmly knew his legacy, like firmly knew, like had a real grasp on his place in history, right? In terms of the he could have just taught law.
That's right.
He could have just been transactional, and instead of being transactional, he was inspirational.
Exactly.
Like he wanted them well-rounded.
That's
and really being a founding father, yes, he signed the Constitution. Yes, he was part of that process, but he was also a really big part of this nation's history in terms of creating the leaders. That's not right. Just Thomas Jefferson. I mean, Thurgood Marshall, right? All these people that that came after that had a lasting, massive impact on the history of this country.
That's right.
I mean, that's a big deal.
One reason that he's called the forgotten founding father is that he never ran. He ran for office in Virginia. He was attorney general, and he was the clerk of the House of Burgesses. He was speaker of the House of Delegates. So he was I won't call him a politician. I'll call him a statesman on the state level. But he never ran for president, and he was, when George Washington was setting up the court system in America, Wythe was offered a very high position in the federal court system. But at that time, Virginia was much more important than the United States because the United States was young, it's new, untried.
Just getting going, yeah.
And Virginia was huge then. Kentucky was still part of it, went all the way to Mississippi. It was the richest, most populous state. So his legacy, well, his work was in Virginia, but it spread because Virginia and Virginians were very, very, very influential. You know, so many founding fathers came from Virginia, and Wythe knew all of them, and he influenced all of them. So yes, his high calling was being a mentor. He did not have any surviving children, and I guess that might have had a lot to do with it. We were told that he had a child that died in infancy. He was married twice and widowed twice. And so he took in boys whose fathers had died and mothers couldn't afford to educate them. And he would take them into his house. And now some people think, well, maybe he was an old pervert because he took care of all these boys and brought them in his house, but he wasn't, because if you read what they said about him, they were so glowing in what they said about his love for them and all that he had taught them and his example. And you wouldn't say that about an abuser.
No, if you look at his life's work, if you look at what he did and the effort that he went to shape this country's legacy and specifically his legacy, you know, that's not the conclusion you draw. The conclusion you draw is this is somebody who believed in people and believed in investing in people. I mean, as far as I can see from what you're sharing, he went above and beyond every time he had an opportunity to go above and beyond to have a lasting, massive impact on this nation's history. When it could have gone any way, right? This country could have failed, and it could have been a short-term democratic experiment that fizzled. If it hadn't have been for people like George Wythe and Thomas Jefferson and Thurgood Marshall and some of these people that are absolute rocks, pillars of our legacy and our history, I mean, those are the shoulders, the giant shoulders that our current leaders stand on. So we wouldn't be where we are today if it hadn't been for him.
Yeah, Chief Justice Marshall was probably well, he definitely was one of the most important Chief Justices of the Supreme Court.
Totally agree.
And pretty much wrote constitutional law for the next generations to come. And Henry Clay was admired for he was just a young hayseed from neighboring county here in Virginia. And his father had died and his mother remarried, and they moved to Kentucky and left him here. Anyway, he was taken in by Wythe and given an education with great library and brought into the law. And he, at 21, I think, became a lawyer. And then he went to Kentucky and did great things in Kentucky. So Wythe's legacy spread west, very much so in Kentucky. The first law school west of the mountains was founded by George Wythe's students, former students. And an amazing number of early senators and congressmen and governors were influenced by that. He never sought national office. He was never a general or a president. And that's why he's called the forgotten founding father.
But he had it seems like a clarified vision of what his legacy, what his role was. And he fulfilled it, in a major way. And it had a major impact on the history of this country. And my goodness, it's amazing that you've documented all this. I cannot thank you enough for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. This has been a lot of fun. And I really, really, really appreciate you being here. It was great to meet you.
Thank you, Mike. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Did you know there's a technology that's actually an app on your phone that uses sound waves to tell your brain what you want your brain to do? We had a young man that was a guest on our podcast, the Mike Litton Experience, who had a traumatic brain injury. He was sleeping 3 hours a night. He's using NewCalm now and he's sleeping more. Go to newcalm.com, Mike15 promo code. newcalm.com, promo code Mike15 for an extra 15% off. Go today.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at the Mike Litton Experience.